the Shroud of Turin. In 1978, a team of over 30 scientists spent 5 days in Turin, Italy, working around the clock on a single piece of linen. They carried equipment from the United States nuclear and space programs. They performed X-ray analysis, ultraviolet fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, microscopy, and chemical testing. They were not there to prove a religious claim. They were there to answer one question: how was the image on this cloth made? They left without an answer. More than 4 decades later, after every technological advance since 1978 has been applied to this object, that question remains open. No scientist, no laboratory, no imaging system has been able to fully explain how the image on this cloth was formed. This is the Shroud of Turin. 14 feet of linen. A faint image of a crucified man. Real human blood. Geological dust from Jerusalem. Pollen from plants that do not grow in Europe. And an image that no one, in nearly 50 years of trying, has been able to reproduce. Today we are going to look at the evidence. All of it, including the evidence that challenges authenticity. And at the end, we are going to ask the question that the evidence ultimately forces. The most studied object in history. The Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth measuring approximately 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. It bears the faint front and back images of a man, head to head, as though a body had been laid on the lower half of the cloth, and the upper half folded over the top. The images show the specific injuries of Roman crucifixion, wounds consistent with scourging across the back, puncture wounds at the wrists and feet, a wound in the side, and marks on the head consistent with a crown of thorns. The bloodstains are not part of the image. They are a separate layer, darker, more saturated, soaked into the cloth in a pattern that is forensically consistent with a real body. It is housed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. And it is, by almost any measure, the most scientifically examined religious artifact in human history. The question that has driven that examination for over a century is not primarily theological. It is scientific. How did the image get there? That question has not yet been answered. And the failure to answer it is not for lack of trying. What the scientists found in 1978. In 1978, the Vatican granted access to an American interdisciplinary team called STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project. The team included physicists, chemists, biologists, photographers, and medical professionals, many of whom had worked in nuclear and space research for the United States government. Their mandate was not to authenticate the shroud. It was to determine, using the best available science, how the image was formed. They were given 5 days and nights of continuous access to the cloth, during which they performed 30 separate scientific tests. Their conclusions, published across 30 scientific papers, established several things that have held up under subsequent examination. The image is not a painting. There is no pigment on the image-bearing fibers. There is no brushstroke pattern. There is no binding agent. The color in the image area comes from chemical alteration of the linen itself, specifically, the oxidation and dehydration of the cellulose in the topmost surface fibers only. The image does not penetrate the thread. It sits on the surface of the individual fibers at a depth that, in some areas, is only the width of a single-cell wall. STURP's conclusion was direct. The image was not the product of an artist. How it was produced remained unknown. The image that should not exist. The image on the shroud has 3 properties that, taken together, have no known parallel in the history of art, chemistry, or physics. The first is superficiality. The image exists only on the outermost fibers of the cloth, at a depth so shallow, that if you were to remove the topmost fibers of a single thread, the image would disappear. No known human technique, painting, printing, scorching, photography, produces an image at this level of surface specificity, while leaving the underlying material unaffected. The second is three-dimensional encoding. In 1976, physicists John Jackson and Eric Jumper fed a photograph of the shroud into a VP8 image analyzer, a device used by NASA to convert image density into topographical data. A normal photograph produces a distorted, meaningless result in this device. The shroud image produced a perfect three-dimensional map of a human body. The image intensity corresponds precisely to the distance between the cloth and the surface of the body it once covered. No known painting or photograph contains this property. It is not a visual characteristic, it is a structural one, encoded in the cloth itself. The third is negative polarity. When Secondo Pia photographed the shroud in 1898 and developed the glass negative, he nearly dropped it. The negative of his photograph revealed a clear, anatomically precise positive image, meaning the image on the cloth itself was already a photographic negative, centuries before photography existed. The face visible in Pia's negative is one of the most recognizable images in the world. It was produced by cloth that predates the concept of a photographic negative by at least 500 years, and possibly 2000. No one has reproduced all three of these properties simultaneously. Every attempt to replicate the shroud image has failed to match one or more of them. The blood that tells a story. The bloodstains on the shroud are not part of the image. They are a separate category of evidence entirely. Multiple independent analyses have confirmed the presence of real human blood on the cloth. The blood is type AB, one of the rarer blood types, appearing in approximately 3 to 5% of the global population. Forensic testing identified the presence of bilirubin, ferritin, and creatinine, compounds associated with extreme physiological trauma and muscle destruction. A 2024 study published in scientific literature specifically described the bloodstain chemistry as consistent with the tortures described in the Gospel accounts of the crucifixion. The pattern of the bloodstains is also forensically significant. The wounds at the wrists, not the palms, are anatomically consistent with crucifixion as practiced by Rome. Medieval art almost universally depicted nail wounds through the palms. A forger working in medieval Europe would almost certainly have followed that convention. The wounds on the shroud are not in the palms. They are in the wrists, precisely where forensic and archaeological evidence, including the first-century skeleton of a crucified man discovered at Givat HaMivtar in Israel, confirms the nails were actually placed. The bloodstains were present on the cloth before the image formed. The image fibers beneath the blood areas show no image formation, meaning whatever process created the image did not affect the areas already covered by blood. The blood came first. The image came second. That sequence is inconsistent with any known forgery technique. What the dirt knows. Among the most quietly compelling evidence on the shroud is what was found on the nose, the knees, and the soles of the feet. Microscopist Joseph Kolbeck and geologist Eugenia Nitowski analyzed samples of dirt from these areas and identified a rare form of limestone called travertine aragonite. The chemical signature of this limestone, including trace elements of iron and strontium, matched samples taken from ancient rock-cut tombs near the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem with a specificity that did not appear elsewhere in the Mediterranean. A medieval European forger working in France or Italy would have had no access to the geological signature of first-century Jerusalem tombs, and no conceivable reason to place it on a cloth. The pollen evidence is equally specific. Swiss criminologist Dr. Max Free applied sticky tape to the shroud in 1978 and subsequently identified over 50 species of pollen. Approximately half of these are from plants native exclusively to the region of Palestine and Anatolia. Several of the identified species do not grow in Europe at all. Israeli botanist Professor Avinom Danon of Hebrew University later confirmed that 28 of the identified pollen species are from plants still growing in Israel, with 70% of them specific to the area between Jerusalem and Jericho. 27 of the identified plant species bloom between March and April, the season of Passover. The Gundelia tournifortii plant, whose pollen is concentrated near the head and shoulder area of the image, has large thorns and blooms in Israel between March and May. These botanical and geological signatures together placed the cloth in the Jerusalem region during the spring season. A medieval forger in Europe could not have placed them there by accident. The carbon dating problem. In 1988, 3 independent laboratories, in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson, performed carbon-14 dating on samples cut from the shroud. Their results placed the cloth between the years 1260 and 1390 AD, consistent with the medieval period and broadly coinciding with the first recorded historical mention of the shroud in France in the 14th century. The media coverage was immediate and widespread. The conclusion was presented as settled: the shroud was a medieval forgery. The problem with that conclusion is that it rests on a single assumption, that the sample tested was representative of the original cloth. Subsequent research has challenged that assumption on multiple grounds. All three laboratories tested samples from the same corner of the cloth, the so-called raised corner, which is the most handled area of the shroud and shows evidence of repair. In 2000, textile expert Mechthild Fleury-Lemberg identified characteristics of this corner consistent with a medieval reweaving, the practice of splicing new threads into damaged cloth. If the tested sample included repaired medieval threads woven into the original ancient linen, the carbon date would reflect the younger material and produce a falsely recent result. In 2022, Italian researcher Dr. Liberato De Caro of Italy's Institute of Crystallography applied a technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering, WAXS, to a thread from the same area tested in 1988. This method measures the structural degradation of cellulose at the molecular level and correlates it with age. The WAXS result placed the linen at approximately 2,000 years old, fully consistent with the 1st century. Dr. De Caro also noted that his sample showed characteristics consistent with contamination or reweaving that would have distorted the 1988 result. The carbon dating has not been definitively refuted, but it has been significantly challenged by multiple independent lines of evidence, and the scientific community does not yet have a consensus resolution. The new evidence: the shroud has not stopped producing new findings. In 2024, researcher William Meacham published analysis of the flax used to make the linen, comparing it against samples from multiple regions and time periods. His results placed the geographic origin of the flax in the Levant, the region of ancient Israel, rather than Europe. In the same year, a Bayesian statistical analysis by researcher Tristan Casabianca systematically evaluated decades of accumulated data using argument mapping. The analysis concluded that the weight of the scientific evidence, taken as a whole, supports a belief in the authenticity of the shroud. This is not a theological claim. It is a probabilistic assessment of the cumulative evidence. In 2025, researchers published an AI-assisted analysis of the shroud's image characteristics, examining both visible light and ultraviolet fluorescence data. The results supported what earlier STURP analysis had suggested, that the image formation involved some form of radiation interacting with the surface fibers of the cloth. The specific type and source of that radiation remain undetermined. The most recent peer-reviewed scientific overview, published in February 2025, concluded what every major study has concluded before it. The answer to how the image was formed remains a mystery, and additional scientific examination of the cloth is warranted. The case against intellectual honesty requires that the counter-arguments be presented with the same seriousness as the evidence for authenticity. The most significant counter-argument remains the 1988 carbon dating. 3 independent laboratories produced consistent results placing the cloth in the medieval period. Critics of the reweaving hypothesis note that no such repair is visually obvious under examination, and that the laboratories took steps to clean the samples before testing. The contamination argument, while plausible, has not been conclusively demonstrated. In 2025, Brazilian digital graphics researcher Cicero Moraes published a 3D simulation study arguing that if a real cloth had been draped over a real human body, the resulting image would be geometrically distorted, inconsistent with the undistorted image on the shroud. His conclusion was that the image was more likely produced by contact with a sculpted surface than a human body. Critics of this study, however, noted that it was used by STURP co-researchers to further eliminate contact transfer as an image formation mechanism, which actually deepens the mystery rather than resolving it in favor of forgery. The weave pattern of the cloth has also been cited as a problem. The herringbone twill with a Z-twist characteristic of the shroud has been described as more consistent with medieval European weaving than 1st century Jewish burial cloths, which were typically plain weave. The evidence on this point is contested. Some textile historians dispute the medieval classification. Microchemist Walter Macron, who examined STURP samples, claimed to have found traces of red ochre and vermilion consistent with medieval artists' pigments. STURP members disputed his methodology and his conclusions, maintaining that the image fibers show no pigment under their own analysis. This disagreement between qualified scientists has not been resolved. What the counterarguments share is that none of them can fully account for the three-dimensional encoding, the superficiality of the image, the blood before image sequence, the Jerusalem geological signatures, or the pollen profile. The strongest argument against authenticity, the carbon date, is the one most actively challenged by subsequent research. What no one can explain. Here is where the evidence lands after nearly 50 years of scientific investigation. The image on the Shroud of Turin is not a painting. The evidence for this is unambiguous: no pigment, no binding agent, no brushstroke pattern, confirmed by the most rigorous forensic analysis applied to any artifact in history. The image contains three-dimensional information encoded into its surface intensity in a way that no known human technique, ancient or modern, can fully reproduce. Every attempt to replicate it has failed to match all its properties simultaneously. The blood on the cloth is real human blood, type AB, bearing the forensic signature of extreme physiological trauma. It predates the image. It is located at the wounds precisely where Roman crucifixion practice would place them, not where medieval European art placed them. The cloth carries the geological signature of 1st century Jerusalem limestone on the nose, knees, and soles of the feet. It carries the pollen signature of the Jerusalem region in spring, the season of Passover. The most recent molecular dating places the linen at approximately 2,000 years old. And the image formation mechanism, after 30 scientific tests in 1978, after every technological advance since, after AI analysis and X-ray scattering and ultraviolet fluorescence, remains, in the language of the most recent peer-reviewed overview, published in February 2025, a mystery. No single hypothesis simultaneously explains all the known characteristics of the image. That conclusion has held for nearly 50 years. It holds today. What the wounds match. Now consider what the wounds on the cloth correspond to. The scourging marks, over 100 individual wound impressions on the front and back of the body, are consistent with the Roman flagrum, a whip with leather thongs tipped with lead or bone. The impressions show a dumbbell-shaped characteristic of this specific instrument. The Gospel of John records that Jesus was flogged before his crucifixion. The puncture wounds on the scalp are consistent with a cap-like arrangement of sharp points, not a simple ring crown, but something covering the entire upper head. The Gospel accounts describe a crown of thorns. The nail wounds are in the wrists, not the palms. The wound in the side is large and elongated, consistent with a Roman spear. John 19 verse 34 records that one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and blood and water came out. The separation of blood and water in a postmortem wound is a medically documented phenomenon consistent with the fluid accumulation that accompanies traumatic death by crucifixion. The man on the cloth did not have his legs broken, a Roman practice called crurifragium used to hasten death. John 19 verse 33 records that when the soldiers came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead and did not break his legs. These correspondences do not prove that the man on the cloth is Jesus of Nazareth. What they establish is that the man on the cloth was crucified in the precise manner described in the Gospel accounts, at the right time, in the right place, with the right injuries, in the right season, on linen whose molecular age, geological markers, and pollen profile place it in 1st century Jerusalem. The question the evidence forces. If the shroud is authentic, and the weight of the physical evidence, taken as a whole, is consistent with that conclusion, then what was inside this cloth? John's Gospel records that when Peter and John entered the empty tomb, they saw the burial cloths lying there, and the face cloth that had been on his head not lying with the linen cloths but folded up in a place by itself. The Greek word for the linen cloths is othonia, burial wrappings. The cloth was there. The body was not. Here is what the shroud tells us about that moment. The image was formed after death. The blood is post-mortem. The image was formed while the cloth was in contact with the body. And yet the body did not decompose inside the cloth. There are no signs of decomposition on the shroud. The wounds are clear. The edges of the bloodstains are sharp. A body left in cloth long enough to decompose would leave unmistakable biological evidence. There is none. The cloth was in contact with a dead body. The body left an image of extraordinary and still unexplained complexity. And then the body was gone, leaving behind a cloth with no signs of decomposition, and an image that 5 decades of science cannot account for. The early disciples who first saw the empty cloths were not looking at the shroud with the benefit of VP8 image analyzers and X-ray scattering technology. They were looking at a linen cloth with the outline of the man they had watched die 3 days earlier. John's Gospel records that when the beloved disciple saw the cloths lying there, he saw and believed. The evidence does not compel faith. It never does. That is not what evidence is for. But it does pose a question that intellectual honesty requires sitting with. If not a painting, if not a medieval forgery, if not a human technique we have yet to identify, then what happened inside this cloth? Isaiah wrote, 7 centuries before the crucifixion, that he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, and by his stripes we are healed. Whether or not the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, and the evidence is compelling enough that the question cannot be dismissed, what it shows us is this: someone was crucified exactly as the Gospels describe. The evidence of that suffering is real. It is measurable. It is still being studied. The cross was not a theological abstraction. It was a physical event that left physical evidence. And the tomb was not a metaphor. It was empty. The mystery that endures. The Shroud of Turin is remarkable not because it demands faith. It is remarkable because it cannot be dismissed. For nearly 50 years, the best-equipped scientific minds in the world have studied this cloth, and the central question, how the image was formed, remains open. Every attempt to reproduce it has failed. Every alternative explanation has left something unaccounted for. The evidence does not settle the question in the way that evidence sometimes does. It deepens it. And a question that deepens under scrutiny, rather than dissolving, is worth staying with. The man on the cloth was crucified. That is not disputed. The wounds on the cloth match the gospel accounts in detail. The geological and botanical signatures place the cloth in 1st century Jerusalem. The molecular dating places the linen at approximately 2,000 years old. And the image that cannot be explained was formed on cloth that was wrapped around a body that left no decomposition trace. Whether that evidence is enough to move you from curiosity to faith is a question only you can answer. But it is worth asking. I invite you to subscribe and join us as we journey together through the pages of Scripture, discovering not only what happened, but why it still matters today. The evidence we examine today is one part of a much larger conversation about the historical reliability of the Gospels, about the archaeology that continues to confirm what Scripture records, and about the God whose actions in history left marks that science is still measuring. We will keep following that conversation here. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Shalom.